In today's lecture, I'm going to cover the basics of the new novice or beginner Lincoln Douglas mandatory national service topic. The resolution reads, resolved in the United States, national service ought to be mandatory. In this lecture, I'm going to look at the key terms of the resolution, the main affirmative arguments, the major negative arguments, and draw a few conclusions. Well, first, let's start talking about the resolution. As I just stated, the resolution reads, in the United States, national service ought to be mandatory. So the United States, it refers to the country of the United States. National service, the one thing is it can usually, people argue for the opportunity to complete it through the Peace Corps. So the Peace Corps is a foreign service program that operates abroad, but it would still arguably be considered in the United States. National service. National service is simply service to one's country. It can include military service or community service, such as the Education Corps, AmeriCorps, could be legal aid. And like I said, it really could even include an international program like the Peace Corps. And if you think about it, the military primarily operates abroad. So the military and the Peace Corps are no different in that regard.
Maybe it makes more sense if we talked about a hybrid model. And you've probably heard of something like this before. Instead of military service, we would need to commit to some form of domestic service. Something like cleaning up a national park, programming new software for a humanitarian cause, or maybe even caring for a combat veteran in our community.
On the other side of public service is national service that we talk about, AmeriCorps, Peace Corps, programs like that, Teach for America. In those cases, we actually have a number of young Americans who would like to serve, but we don't have enough positions and funding to allow everyone who is interested to serve.
Ought. Ought just kind of brings up the question of should versus would, right? So only the government could require this, and it's in the context of the government. But the affirmative is not advocating for a specific policy. They're just saying this ought to exist, right? So that's one important thing about ought. And the second, and there's always been debates about this in Lincoln Douglas, is whether or not it requires there to be a moral obligation. And we'll talk more about moral obligations. There's a little bit of a distinction, right? You can say, I ought to help somebody. That kind of might imply a moral obligation. You might say, I ought to go to McDonald's and get some French fries. But that doesn't mean you have a moral obligation to get French fries. But it could certainly be interpreted as a moral obligation. Then mandatory. Mandatory just means really that there's a law that requires you to do it. Now, obviously, when there's a law can be enforced through fines and through jail. The proposals here are really talking about making this a criminal offense and you going to jail. Otherwise, a wealthy person could obviously just buy out of the mandatory service. One question is created is what's a possibility of mandatory service? So currently, all males have to register for the draft when they turn 18, but females do not. And one of the proposals that's discussed in this context is whether or not females should have to register as well. But they wouldn't actually be doing the service unless the government instituted the draft, which in the United States really only happens in wartime. So I don't know if that's topical, but it'll come up in that questions. Now, what are the core debates? There are core debates about should it be mandatory or compulsory, right? So there are actually fewer advocates for mandatory national service than there are for national service in general.
I actually think it should become a common expectation more than a mandatory year of service. Everybody now is expected to go to high school, right? It's just assumed that you go to middle school or junior high and then you go to high school. So really creating the cultural shift that it becomes natural to say to a young person, where are you going to do your service year? I think if people were proximate to some of the challenges that are going on in our communities and really felt like they had the ability to do something about those problems, it would create a different culture of how we come together as citizens to solve problems in our communities.
Second is should we invest in this? Could be really expensive, right? You think about millions of people now doing national service. They would have to be compensated in some way, probably by the government. That would be very expensive. In the real world, there are probably only two cases. Some people say, all right, everybody should have to serve in the military. That's pretty rare. But what people are really advocating, which I think why there's probably really, at least in the literature, just kind of one affirmative case. And that is to say, you have to do mandatory national service. You could join the military. You could be in the Peace Corps. You could deliver legal aid. You could be in AmeriCorps. So negative should be well prepared to debate mandatory. Now, in certain areas in the United States, in Lincoln Douglas debate, you can suggest an alternative or a counterplan. You could say, no, we should just have voluntary national service, which was a very common argument when this topic's been debated in the past. But you could also, in the past, before there were even counterplans, even in policy debate, we had an argument called justification. And the negative would push the affirmative to say, well, why does it have to be federal action instead of state action, right? Like the individual states, the individual 50 states. So you could have a debate here about trying to push the affirmative to justify why it has to be mandatory, which is hard to defend. But regardless of whether or not the negative can suggest an alternative, they can certainly criticize the mandatory nature. So in the historical context, right, we've kind of trying to be drawing people together, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, to have everybody involved in this. And in the past, right, in ancient civilizations, it's primarily been used for conscription, for kind of military purposes. And there are many countries in the world that do have mandatory national service. It's usually for military reasons. Their militaries are not strong enough. But some of the countries do provide some additional options. And these are some of the main countries that have or have had recently mandatory national.
According to the CIA, there are more than 60 countries on Earth that require citizens to serve in the military. From Mexico to Russia, Denmark to Israel, Estonia to North Korea, and many others. And out of these, Israel is probably the best known because it requires both men and women to serve.
So my name is Shaked Danai, and I've served in the IDF, as Israeli Defense Force, for 2 years. So it's like mandatory. So after you finish high school at 18, basically you go.
In Lincoln Douglas debate, we debate core values, and these values are often articulated at the top of the case, which we'll talk about in other lectures. But so, for example, the affirmative may say our value is morality, and we determine that, our criteria for determining that is what is the greatest good for the greatest number. So they may use that to justify, right, as I just explained, having everybody participate in national service to the benefit of the country. The negative debater may also say there's a moral obligation, but we should assess this based on deontology, which comes from Immanuel Kant, and we should never use somebody as a means to an end. So we shouldn't require somebody to do something to take away their freedom to accomplish a larger objective. So what are some of the major philosophers, especially that people debate about frequently? What do they think about this? Now, none of them, I believe, have written specifically about national service. But you look at a philosopher like John Rawls, who supports fairness in supporting protecting the least advantaged members of society. He might say, well, it's fair for everybody to have to serve in the military, not just people who can't find a job or come from lesser economic means, which is also what's happened. Which is often what has happened. But it's tricky because Rawls also strongly believed in liberty, and this is a mandatory requirement. You have Immanuel Kant, who believed in a sense of duty or obligation to your government, to your people, to your community. But he also believed in autonomy and dignity, that you should never use people as a means to an end, which means that you should never take a person and say, we're going to force you to do this because it's going to produce some greater outcome. That's using somebody as a means to an end. I think, Kant especially will end up being used a lot on the negative. Rousseau, he believed in civic virtue, but he also, right? So mandatory national service could capture that. But he also believed in moral freedom. You have John Stuart Mill, who believed in the greatest good for the greatest number of people, right? So you could easily justify that. And especially in a military draft in a war, you could say people need to join the military and protect the country. That's the greatest good for the greatest number. But again, he also believed in freedom. Nussbaum and Sen, they believed in a capabilities approach to justice, that everybody should contribute their own capabilities, whatever their capabilities are, in order to develop a more just world. So that's potentially more on the affirmative than on the negative. The thing I want to mention is that in the United States, we've never had mandatory national service except during wartime, right? So we're not now actively engaged in a war. We're involved in different military activities around the world, but no war has been declared. There's no major kind of military activities. We don't even have something like we had in Iraq, which was a significant deployment, but involving over 100,000 troops. We don't even have anything like that going on now. So to institute mandatory national service in a time outside of significant warfare would be quite exceptional. So now we're going to look at the affirmative arguments in favor of requiring mandatory national service. First, there's the argument that people should share the burden of war. It shouldn't just fall on people from lower economic classes who often end up being the ones who join the military because they don't have strong enough educational foundations, or they just don't see what alternatives are, or because the job market in like a rural area is very limited. So they kind of just go into the military. And obviously, if they die or they're injured, they're the ones who really bear the cost of the war, whereas everybody else in society does not. And this is a very strong argument in favor of making it compulsory, that everybody has to do it. Otherwise, it's not going to be shared. Even if you just provide more incentives for people to join the military or to participate in national service, that's not going to capture, generally speaking, people from higher socioeconomic classes. Second, there's the argument in favor of national unity. You can read a lot about how, as a country, we're more and more divided. And some people blame this on social media. That's obviously debatable. But the fact that there is a division is probably not that debatable. And the reason that is that people tend to grow up with people who are similar to them. They tend to pursue careers that their parents pursued. They tend to live in areas that they're already from. They tend to end up in a similar socioeconomic situation to other people in their families. They tend to associate with the same racial groups that they have in their childhood. So we've kind of become a pretty divided country. And there's a pretty strong argument to make that when people all have to join in a national service program, they're going to end up working with people from all over the country, from all different types of backgrounds, racial backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, geographic backgrounds, and they're all going to get to learn about each other and understand each other and learn that in the end, people are not really that different.
The training was, well, basic. We learned to fire weapons, survive gas attacks, administer first aid. We learned to follow orders. But above all, we learned in training, as would be reinforced in combat, to work together as a team, despite our differences, to run together toward the enemy. I mean, you had a gruff specialist from Boston, side by side with a moon-eyed private from Kansas, a religious kid from Chicago's inner city, and the college kid raised in a cul-de-sac. It was a true blending of regions, races, religions, and socioeconomic backgrounds. And you know, we found that we all had the same emotions of fear, embarrassment, and elation as we confronted and later overcame our first obstacle course. Less than 1% of Americans have served in uniform, and the relational, political, socioeconomic, and cultural divides have never been greater. That is why I believe the time has come to enter into a conversation about a national service program, a common training and proving ground with a range of options: Peace Corps, City Year, Teach for America, AmeriCorps, and yes, military service.
A third argument is that this would encourage citizens would become more engaged in politics, especially on issues related to foreign policy, right? Like some people now think, okay, the president's decided to deploy the military abroad, but that doesn't really affect anybody in my family. So they might become more involved, right? Even if they're just doing a service project, they might think, well, gee, why do I have to do this for 2 years? What's going on in government? What's going on in politics? Why is this important to my country? What are my values? What are the values of my country? This could increase civic engagement and even things like participation in elections and participation in democracy. The primary value of democracy is that people participate in. A fourth argument is that it could actually have a benefit. It could solve some social problems, right? We have people engaged in programs potentially under a national service framework where they're trying to improve educational outcomes. They're trying to reduce poverty. It also would benefit the participants. They would probably become more mature. People say that when people are in the military, they develop a maturity. They develop life skills. They develop career skills, all before they actually go into the regular workforce.
70 years ago, another generation of battle-tested veterans returned home. They had entered basic training as individuals, and they were molded into soldiers and sailors, nurses and pilots. They prepared to serve. And then in war zones and on the home front, they ran to answer the call. And finally, they returned to their civilian life, energized to inspire others to service. In the Greatest Generation's Day, some 77% of America's representatives in city halls, state houses, and Congress had served in the armed forces.
There's also argument, of course, that it benefits the military. The United States military is struggling to recruit right now. And people argue how significant of a problem this is, but obviously if we need more troops and we could put people in some additional roles, This would be great, potentially great for the military. It's a bit debatable, as we'll talk about on the negative, but it could strengthen U.S. military readiness and maybe reduce costs over the long term because they wouldn't have to pay people as much if they were required to join the military or commit to a lifetime of benefits if they only served a certain number of years. Finally, there's an argument for improving civil-military relations. What do I mean by that? Well, there's a gap in society between the military, people who are engaging in military service, serving overseas, and people who do not engage in such service. And you often hear people, especially young people, criticizing the military. Oh, it's violent, it's aggressive, it's militaristic. I don't want to be part of the military. But once you understand the role of the military in a country, the importance of defending a society, defending freedom, and just interacting with people who are in the military, this has a good chance of changing perspectives. And of course, people in the military will also see the more of the quote-unquote civilian side. And this could reduce tension between the military and civilians in society. Finally, there's the argument of reduced military adventurism. What do I mean by this? I mean that if everybody's sons and daughters have to serve in the military, people are probably going to start to question some of the military activities the United States engages in abroad. And it's probably not going to be our bases in Japan or bases in South Korea. It's probably going to be some of the aggressive military actions that we've taken in the past, right, such as in Iraq or maybe even our troop deployments in Syria or in certain parts of Africa that people are going to question and say, does the United States really need this big, aggressive military footprint abroad? Do we need to be so quick to launch what many people see as wars of aggression?
We now know that over time, warfare has been directly impacting fewer and fewer Americans. Since 1980, the percentage of the U.S. population with military experience has shrunk from 18% to 7%. And that percentage is still dropping today. By 2040, the Department of Veterans Affairs projects that that number could be as low as 3.5%. Now, let's take this into context. During the Vietnam War, 3.5 million Americans were on active duty, but the total number for any given year since 9/11 has never exceeded 1.5 million. That's less than half of 1% of our current total population.
Over the years, the military as a whole, the population's declined.
Since World War II, U.S. forces have been sent all over the world in the name of the Cold War and the War on Terror. Now, some of these years were obviously more deadly than others, but to be clear, the 75% we're referencing doesn't even include military operations like expeditions and occupation, which didn't experience direct combat, which means America has only been at complete peace for 28 years.
Now, let's look at the negative arguments. The primary argument against mandatory national service, as I've been alluding to, is that it is mandatory. It is coercive to require people to serve the country. It's arguably a violation of freedom.
The argument could also be made that it violates the rights of the individual. We're a nation based on the merits of freedom, after all.
We don't make people do things. It talks about Kant and how you shouldn't view people as a means to an end. Now, the Supreme Court, as you can read about, has upheld national service in wartime for a military draft. But beyond kind of the general philosophical objections to coercion, in the United States, we have the 13th Amendment, which prohibits slavery. So there's kind of a related question of whether or not it's even legal to require people to do work. Now, at least we are paying them. There are other things that people have to do in society that are not voluntary. So, for example, you have to pay taxes. It's not that in society there aren't any mandatory requirements, but requiring 2 years of labor, even if compensated, is quite a significant intrusion on freedom. The second negative argument is cost, right? You would just think of the millions of people who turn 18 every year, and sometimes you see, say, the ages of 18 and 22 or a little bit older, they have to do service. That means millions of people will become essentially employees of the government. Even if they were not paid, just the cost of administering the program, of housing the individuals, of dealing with any issues that arise, would be astronomical and overwhelming. We can see that it might even cost trillions of dollars.
It would cost literally trillions of dollars to train millions of new young people every year.
There's other things that could have effects on the economy. It could reduce the active labor force, right? Right now, we're getting to the point where there's an arguable shortage of workers. Unemployment is really low right now. So if we were to take people out of the regular economy, where they maybe are currently working or where they're expected to be working, the cost to employers of hiring people would rise a lot because there's fewer people that are hireable, which could trigger even more inflation than we see in the economy. Plus, you might be injecting trillions of dollars of additional spending by the federal government into the economy, which could also be inflationary. So there's many economic disruptions that would occur, but I think when, primarily you're looking at massive disruptions to the labor market, as well as a lot more government spending, which is likely to prove to be inflationary. And then, of course, maybe the government would raise taxes. Now, raising taxes could be deflationary, but that could hurt the economy in other ways. So there are massive economic disruptions to debate. Now, there's also the argument that it hurts individuals. Well, how so? Well, it could delay their education. Maybe they're planning to go to college. Now they have to delay that. Once they go into the service program, they may decide not to go to college. A lot of people have other obligations to families, such as caring for a sibling or a sick parent or a grandparent, and they wouldn't be able to do that anymore because they'd be kind of sent into some national service program. And of course, in some low-paying jobs, right? Like, working in a nursing home, those types of situations, those jobs don't pay well, but you are performing service, right? Like, it is helping people. And if you take people away from those jobs to go, plant trees somewhere, then we could see some problems develop. It might trigger more early marriages, people say. If people are going to be split apart and have to go away from each other, then they might get married early. And if they get married too early, that could cause problems. Some people say it's actually going to hurt the military. On the affirmative side, we talked about the benefits of the military, but it could hurt the military because, first of all, the military now has to deal with like millions of more people potentially in the military. They've added all the added costs and training associated with that. Then after, like, say 1, 2, or 3 years, whatever the service time is, all those people are going to leave the military. At least most of them probably would. So that training doesn't really help the military.
Not everyone wants to be in the military. Like any organization, it's just not a fit.
It's not for everybody.
Right, it's not for everybody. The other piece, again, is by the time probably you're proficient at your job, you're going to be leaving.
There could also be a lot of political opposition to this. In traditional Lincoln Douglas circuits, we don't have as much debating of politics. The argument that, like, well, if there's political opposition, that'll hurt Biden's political capital and he can't get another agenda item passed. But this does come up on some circuits. It's more of a policy debate argument, but it does come up in LD on some circuits. And depending on where you debate, you might have to deal with this argument. There's also arguments related to wars of aggression. So if we have more people in the military, we have millions of more troops, then we may be more likely to engage in wars of foreign aggression if it's true that having more people in the military benefits the military. There's also, we can start to get into other critiques such as capitalism. Capitalism bad is a common debate argument, which says that if you do things that promote capitalism, right? So if you train people to be better workers, if you train them to kind of integrate into the capitalist economy, into the capitalist society, that'll promote capitalism, and capitalism is bad. We also there's various versions of kind of anti-blackness related to like Afro-pessimism that says that civil society is bad and it's bad to kind of reaffirm the ideas of the civic, which is a lot of the ideas behind mandatory national service, that we need to have a strong democracy, we need to have a strong civil society. Afro-pessimists criticize the very idea of civil society, arguing that it is anti-black. And of course, then just a practical argument, there's arguments about court clog. Why? Because there's probably going to be exceptions to these circumstances, right? Like you can say you have a mental health issue, you have a physical health issue, you have the litigation that would occur over whether the program should exist in the first place. There'd probably be a massive amount of litigation triggered by a mandatory national service program that could end up clogging the courts. I also want to talk about a few proposals that you might want to research. I'm not proposing that you actually go advocate one of these specific things, but Barack Obama, Peter Buttigieg, Seth Moulton have all proposed voluntary service programs. So if you do some research around what they're advocating, you'll find some affirmative evidence, even though it's not in the context of mandatory service. And John Delaney and Charles Rangel, two American politicians, they have proposed mandatory national service programs. This was a while. This is not a contemporary discussion whether there should be mandatory national service. But if you look back like 5-10 years ago, there were discussions of this. And of course, there are some recent articles that we've quoted from in the evidence release. So it's not that nobody is talking about this. It's just, it's not like a big debate that's out there right now. Think about the current debates, like the war in the Ukraine, artificial intelligence, like taxation, right? Curriculum in schools. Those are big societal debates. This is not really currently a big societal debate. Finally, I want to conclude with some strategic thoughts, right? So on the affirmative, it's very important in the 1AC or the affirmative constructive that you have a strong defense of why it needs to be mandatory. Because whether or not the negative has a counter plan or a justification argument or just an argument about coercion and slavery, they're almost certain to challenge the idea that service should be mandatory. So you'll definitely want to have some defense of why it needs to be mandatory in your first speech. And obviously, as I've discussed, advantages that are related to compulsory services such as national unity, equality, reducing racism from the inequality could all get you pretty far there. You also need to have some angle on these critiques, right? You need to have some defense of the state. Why is it good to support the government? Why is it good to defend civil society, right? Like you're saying that these service programs should exist as a part of national service. Like you are saying that implicitly or explicitly that the government is good, that organizing programs around the government is good, that we should be more kind of oriented towards our government. These are all things that are very important, and you need to have some defense of that. I think, too, in the real world, so to speak, there's probably only one AF, and that is to, say, have mandatory national service and let people choose. And it's like, there are other good affirmatives if the word mandatory wasn't in the resolution, right? So legal aid. Like you could just say, hey, we should support service and people should give legal aid to the poor. But the case for making that mandatory is really, really weak and probably not very defensible. You can say we should plant trees. On past topics, people have said, we should have national service programs where everybody goes around and plants trees and that'll solve climate change. But a mandatory defense of that is really, really weak. Like we could clearly pay enough people to go plant trees and like solve climate change in some other way or install solar panels. We don't need to force people to install solar panels or plant trees. I mean, that's borderline ridiculous. So the word mandatory in the resolution, I think, is really going to effectively limit the number of cases. And then, of course, on the negative, as I've been suggesting, you have the voluntary, whether it's a justification argument or a counter plan or just an objection, right? Like the disadvantages to requiring this are really, really strong. And this alternative, if you can get away with it or press it as a justification argument of it not being mandatory, is very, very good. Now, finally, I'll conclude. And, this lecture, I've tried to keep it short. I'm committed this year to keeping all lectures to 30 minutes or less because I know that's about the most students will listen to them. There's a longer essay on the site, which is freely available, that you can read.